Hi, everybody. So glad we're together again. The Tanglewoods Secret, chapters 7 and 8. You remember a lot about the previous chapters, I'm sure, but you remember that Ruth and Philip are trying to save money so that Philip can buy a camera so he can take pictures of all those fledgling birds that they see in the pretty nests. And he wants to use those to illustrate a book he's writing about birds and birds' nests and birds' habits and their food and all that kind of thing. So they've decided that a good way to earn some money might be to pick flowers. There are plenty of them in the spring. They're at home on their Easter vacation. And so they've started picking flowers and trying to sell them. But as you remember from last time, it didn't go so well because they didn't put them in any water and they had all wilted when they got to the houses. But anyway, they've learned their lesson and we'll see if they're any more successful this time. This chapter is called An Unfortunate Tea Party. We went out flower selling nearly every afternoon after that for a week and earned nearly $4. We never again met anyone quite so nice as that bird man, but quite a lot of people seemed pleased with our flowers and did buy bunches of them. They looked better, too, because we remembered to put them in water instead of selling them all at once, and the basket of fresh, wild bunches did make a good show. We took Terry into our confidence, and he didn't mind at all. In fact, he helped us quite a lot, for he had a gift of selecting just the right colors and arranging them to perfection. In order that Aunt Margaret shouldn't see the flowers, we kept the bucket by the gap in the hedge, and Terry would sometimes arrive there late in the evenings and add a few bunches to ours. We had shown him our private gap as a mark of our friendship, and he used to creep in and out like a small weasel and leave notes for us stuck on the apple branches. His spelling was a little shaky, but that didn't worry us at all, and anyway, we had invented a code in case Uncle Peter ever found them when attending to the hens. Aunt Margaret we felt quite safe about. She never went into the orchard. Most mornings we found a scrap of paper on an apple branch which said, maybe I'd better just show you in the book what it said. Let's see. When I'm looking at it backwards. But can you read right there? It says, "Come to the wigwam and bring." Ooh, what in the world would that be, do you think? This meant that Terry would be waiting for us at the wigwam and would require feeding. And where Terry commanded, we always obeyed. Aunt Margaret almost gave up the unequal struggle of trying to make me help in the house, and I became really gifted in getting out of doing my chores. If ever I had a twinge of conscience about her tired and rather sad face, I managed to forget it the minute I had dived through that gap in the hedge and was out into the world again. It was toward the end of the week, when we were sitting at dinner, that my aunt remarked, "I'm going out to tea this afternoon, Philip and Ruth, and I shall not be back until about 6. You may take your tea out and not come back until supper time, if you like." And you remember that supper was the meal that you ate close to bedtime, and tea was what you had at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We both did like very much, and we kicked each other joyfully under the table. "Who are you going out to tea with, Auntie?" inquired Philip, who always took a polite interest in other people's affairs. "Oh, with an old friend of mine who's come to live here just lately," answered my aunt. "And later on I should like to introduce you to her. She is very fond of children and has often asked about you. She knew your mother, too." "Will she ask us out to tea, too?" I inquired with interest. I always liked to go out to tea because we always had such nice things to eat. "Well, if she did so, you would have to behave yourself better than you have been doing," replied my aunt dryly, and I frowned and wriggled with annoyance. Why should she always spoil even nice, good things like our going out to tea with silly remarks like that? Of course I would always behave myself out to tea. I was far too shy not to, and in any case it was rather fun having grown-ups say how well-mannered we were. Quite a change, too, as far as I was concerned. With dinner over, my aunt hurried me off to the kitchen to help dry the dishes, which I did at lightning speed, and I made off the instant I'd finished. Aunt Margaret called after me to come back and put the dish towel away neatly, but I pretended not to hear, and I rushed through the front door. I knew she couldn't possibly catch me, for I was as fleet-footed as a little rabbit, and she might have forgotten about it by the evening. Going out to tea would drive it out of her memory. Philip was waiting near the gap, looking rather anxious, with the basket in his hand. "Come along," he said. "We must get well away before Auntie starts. We might meet her. I forgot to ask her which way she was going." "Oh, I think she's going on the road down to town," I answered carelessly. "I heard her say something to Uncle Peter about it, that she was going down Beach Road." "Perhaps she was going to see somebody else then," said Peter. "Oh, no. I'm sure it's the same person. She doesn't go and see that too many people. She's too busy." Philip chewed a piece of grass thoughtfully. "She's always working, isn't she?" he remarked at last. "Sometimes I think we ought to help her a bit more than we do. After all, it is very kind of her to have us come and live with her because, we're not her children." "Oh, I don't know," I said quickly, for this sort of talk was not to my liking. "I help with the drying up and dusting sometimes, and you do wood for Uncle Peter, and we both pick fruit in the summer, and we shell peas and things. After all, we're not grown-ups, and children shouldn't have to work on their holidays. We do quite enough work in the school term." But I could see by the look on Philip's face that he was not quite satisfied, so I changed the subject as soon as possible. "We went down a country road today, to a collection of rather pretty cottages, mostly inhabited by retired elderly ladies. The boughs of the hedges were weighed down with blossoms, and underneath, on the banks, there were buttercups and nettles and speedwells and parsley growing in a sweet, scented riot, all stretching up toward the sunshine. It was the high tide of early summer, and the birds sounded as though they would burst with song. It was a peaceful sort of day when no one would expect anything to happen, and so we were taken completely by surprise, never dreaming that the afternoon would turn out as it did. The old ladies were unusually nice, too, and at the first 4 houses, everybody bought something, and we earned over 50 cents. Most old ladies fell in love with Philip and did whatever he wanted. I suppose it was his blue eyes and his polite, serious way of speaking. One of them patted him on the head and said, "What a fine little man," which he didn't like at all. And one of them gave us a chocolate each, which we did like very much. She was a rosy old lady with cheeks the color of apples, and she said Philip reminded her of her grandson. And he replied in his sweetened voice that she reminded him of our grandmother. And that pleased her greatly, and she ran inside and produced more chocolate. "Philip," I said severely when we were outside, "you haven't seen Granny for years. I don't believe you can remember her at all." "Oh, yes, I can," he replied contentedly, licking away at his chocolate. "She had white hair and smelled like mothballs." "But this one had gray hairs and smelled like smoked fish," I argued. "At least the house did. I think she was frying some up for her tea." "Oh, well," said my brother placidly, "it doesn't matter. She could easily remind me of Granny by just being an old lady. They're all the same. Let's have some tea." So we wandered up a lane and sat on a gate looking over a beautiful buttercup field where sleepy brown cows chewed their cuds and switched their tails lazily. We munched our bread and jam. That seems to be what Philip and Ruth have every day for their tea, isn't it? Bread and butter and jam sandwiches. Sounds like not a bad afternoon snack. So they ate their bread and jam sandwiches as peacefully as the cows and almost as silently, for Philip was not really a talkative boy. He had a good deal to think about, as he sometimes told me while I chattered away. When we finished, we lay down in the grass and had a drink from a pipe which was spurting water out of the bank and into the creek. It didn't taste very nice, and I thought it had an unpleasant flavor. Philip drank a good deal and then remarked that he hoped it wasn't a sewer pipe. It was only 4 o'clock, so we decided to go back to the road and try some more cottages. We were going to do our best today and then go back to Terry and the woods tomorrow, for we were getting a little tired of flower selling. Still, it was encouraging to be finishing up so well, and On reaching the road, we approached the next cottage, hopefully enough. It was a very nice one, long, low, and built of grey stone, with beds of tulips against it. It stood on a little rise of ground, and a pink and white apple orchard sloped away from one side of it. We pattered up the path and along to the front door, and on our way we passed under a window and heard the clink of china and the sound of ladies' voices. It sounded as if some sort of a tea party was going on, and ladies at tea parties are usually in a rather good mood, as Philip wisely remarked. We rang the bell, and the drawing room opened immediately. A young lady came out and stood looking at us for a moment and asked us what we wanted. We held up our basket and asked her to buy some flowers, and her face dimpled with amusement. I had noticed that a good many people were amused when we told them we were flower sellers, but I never understood why. "Wait a minute," she said, instead of answering our question. "I must ask Mother, and then you must come in and show us what you've picked." She disappeared into the drawing room. You know, that's the living room. And we heard her merry laugh as she told her mother about us. "Such a picturesque little couple," she said. "They're pretending to be flower sellers. The boy has a face like an angel, and the girl looks like a wild little gypsy. You must see for yourselves. I'll bring them in." She reappeared all smiles and held out her hand. "Come in just a moment," she said, "and I'll show my mother and my aunt your basket. I'm sure they would like to buy some cowslips. You shall have a cookie, too. We're just having our tea." So we trotted in after her, suspecting nothing, and then we both stopped dead in the doorway, transfixed with horror. Can you guess what's coming next? I bet you can. There were 4 chairs placed around a little table in the window so that the ladies were sitting with their backs to us. In the first chair sat a tall, elderly lady who was evidently the mother, for she was pouring tea. Next to her sat the aunt, and next to her was the empty seat, which would be occupied by the young lady, and next to that was a high-backed armchair with large sides, and from the depths of it came the perfectly unmistakable voice of our aunt. "That little girl is very unruly," said the voice confidentially. "I shall be only too glad when her mother comes and takes her off my hands." "Run," I whispered to Philip. "Oh, Philip, run quickly." But Philip, in his usual slow fashion, had not yet realized what had happened. He just stood there blinking as if he was in some puzzling dream. I knew that it would be several minutes before he made up his mind to run, and by that time it was too late, so I cast about in my mind for some other way of escape. There was one slender hope. If we walked in and stood right behind my aunt's chair, it would be quite impossible for her to see us without doing some extraordinary gymnastics, for the chair was very big. If we were required to speak, she would certainly know that it was us. However, it was our only chance. As the young lady was beckoning to us to come forward, wondering why we were hesitating, I took Philip's hand and led him safe to the only safe spot in the room. Old Mrs. Sheridan and her sister smiled and tried to put us at our ease. She held out her hand for a bunch of cowslips. I took 2 steps forward, leaned right over, and handed them to her, and rushed back to my hiding place like a frightened rabbit. The girl looked rather surprised, for we hadn't seen Very Shy on her doorstep, yet here we were behaving in a most peculiar fashion. Philip was standing like a stuffed image with his mouth open, looking as though we were seeing a ghost. "What beautiful flowers," said Mrs. Sheridan, examining the clusters. "We shall have to go exploring and find some too. Where did you pick these, children?" There was a dead silence. Neither of us dared to speak. I heard a rustle in the armchair, as though my aunt was about to turn around and examine these strange, dumb specimens behind her, and if her head suddenly appeared over the top, I knew I would scream. So I replied in a hoarse whisper, "In the hollow by the stream." "By the stream," replied Mrs. Sheridan. "Yes, I might have known these had grown near water. I shall certainly buy a bunch. Fetch my purse, Isabel, and give these 2 children a cookie before they go." The children held out the plate, but to reach it, we would have to walk out into the open. We shook our heads frantically and lifted imploring eyes, but she thought we were merely being polite. "Come along," she said laughingly. "They're very nice cookies." Hopelessly, I took 2 steps forward and leaned over as far as I could to grab 2 cookies, but as I did so, I saw my aunt's hat move, and I leaped backwards, and in so doing, I bumped into a small cake stand and sent it flying. At which point my aunt's head came right around the edge of the chair, and she saw me. I can only dimly remember what happened next. I heard my aunt say, "Philip and Ruth, what is the meaning of this?" in a voice that reminded me of a bugle blast. And I heard Mrs. Sheridan say, "Pick them up, Isabel. They're butter side down, all over the carpet. Don't let them get trodden in." I saw Philip move back and trip over Isabel, who was picking up buttered buns, and I noticed that her face looked as though she were trying hard not to laugh. I remember everybody apologizing for everybody, and my aunt saying she could not understand it a great many times, and Mrs. Sheridan saying that it was nothing to worry about and we were to forget all about it. The next thing that came to mind was my aunt's turning to us when the commotion had died down and telling us that she was taking us home to punish us most severely. But before we went, we were to come forward and tell Mrs. Sheridan how very sorry we were for behaving so badly. Philip had regained his senses by now, and he stepped forward immediately and looked up into Mrs. Sheridan's face. He was truly sorry for having spoiled such a nice tea party, especially when Aunt Margaret went to so few, and he said so earnestly and so politely that everyone was charmed, and even my aunt looked pleased. If only she could have stopped there, all would have ended peacefully, but now she turned to me and asked me coldly what I had to say for myself. I don't quite understand to this day why I was so angry, but while Philip was talking, I had decided that my aunt was an idiot, and there was no need to have recognized us and owned us. We would never have shown we belonged to her, and then nobody would have known. Therefore, I argued, she had brought all this trouble on herself, and here we were being told we were naughty in front of everyone, and we weren't naughty. Why shouldn't we sell flowers? Anyone would think we were stealing. All this flashed through my rebellious little heart when my aunt spoke to me, and for an answer, I stuck my hands in my pocket and stamped my muddy boots. "I'm not a bit sorry," I stormed. "We were not doing anything wrong, and no one called us naughty until we met you. We've earned the money, and it belongs to us, and we shall go on doing it if we want. You're always spoiling everything, Aunt Margaret." My aunt went very white. Never in my worst moments at home had I ever spoken to her like this, and here I was, disgracing us all in someone else's drawing room. I suddenly felt terrible and miserable and ran out into the garden, leaving them all standing there just looking at each other. I wanted to dash on, but I realized that they might think I was running away, and I was far too proud to run away, so I walked off toward home with my hands in my pockets, my head held very high in the air. I knew my aunt and Philip were coming down the hill behind me, so I pretended to whistle, but I was too miserable to keep it up for long. And when I reached home, I went and stared out of the kitchen window and tried to whistle again. I wanted to look as if nothing had happened, and as though I didn't care if it had. Above all, I would not be sorry. My aunt came in slowly, as though she was very, very tired. She crossed the room and stood behind me, looking out of the window. "Ruth," she said very heavily, "I am not going to punish you because it doesn't seem to do much good, but I have been thinking about it on the way home. I don't seem to be able to manage you or bring you up as I should. You have 10 days more holiday, and then, if they can take you, I am sending you to a boarding school. Your mother suggested it at Christmas, but I wanted to keep you until then. Of course, it'll be a big extra expense, but anything is better than having you grow up to be a selfish, obstinate, and ill-mannered lady, as you seem to be doing right now." She turned away without looking at me, and I went on staring out the window. I felt as if the whole world was falling down around me. I wanted to run to Philip and bury my face in his sweater and cry like I used to when I was a tiny girl, but Philip had been sent straight upstairs to bed, and I was all alone. "I shan't go," I said in what was meant to be a defiant voice, but it sounded kind of shaky. "You won't be asked," said my aunt quietly. There was a long silence, and I stood perfectly still, thinking furiously. Then I spoke again in the same trembly voice that tried so hard to be proud. "Very well, then," I said. "I shall run away, and I shan't come back." And with that, I ran straight out the door, and into the road. My aunt took no notice. It was very early, and I often rushed out like that in a temper. No doubt I would come back before dark. What she did was to sigh heavily and go slowly up to her room. Shall I read another chapter called Running Away? Okay, I will. I did not stop for a minute when I got into the road. It didn't matter to me where I went as long as I got away, and in my angry heart I decided that I would never, never go back again. I would be a gypsy's little girl, or get some kind lady to adopt me, or ask someone to let me be their servant. Then Aunt Margaret would be sorry. I knew Uncle Peter would miss me when he came home every night, and of course Philip would be dreadfully sad. And at the thought of Philip, my eyes brimmed over with tears. I went on running and running, with the tears streaming down my cheeks, breathless and sobbing. I had chosen the white country road that leads away into Herefordshire between young wheat fields and banks of flowers. It was a pretty but lonely road, rising up over hills and dipping down into valleys, twisting so that you always wanted to go on and see what was around the next bend. But now it was at its most beautiful, with the evening light shining on it, and buttercup meadows and the shadow of the trees, quiet across the gold fields, but I noticed nothing, and I was quite out of breath. So I settled down into a trot. And so I trotted on, not caring where I was going, and much too miserable to wonder what was going to become of me. "You're going away to boarding school," I kept whispering those horrid words to myself and trying to take it all in. I saw myself as going away in disgrace, alone in a train, to a building which I imagined would be rather like a jail. And I imagined Terry and Philip singing in the wigwam together, with the birds singing too, and the foxgloves sprouting, and the wild roses uncurling, and I wouldn't be there. Then other pictures seemed to dance in my eyes. Philip kneeling alone at the bedroom window with the sun rising, and my little bed empty. Philip lying on his tummy in the hayfields writing his book, and I wouldn't be there to draw the pictures. It was quiet all around me as I trotted along. I had met no one, and except for the cries of the birds going to bed and my own sobbing, the world was very silent. But suddenly now I became aware of the sound of children's voices and a barking dog. So I rubbed away the tears with the back of my hands and looked around me. I had come to the entrance of the village. I'd been there once or twice before. It was a small village, only a few cottages, a white square school building, a village shop, and a church. It nestled in a dip of the low hills just where a country road met the larger main road, and there was a signpost there. I stood for some little time wondering what to do. I didn't want to walk through the village just yet, for I knew everyone would know that I'd been crying. Besides, I was hot and dreadfully tired, and my head was beginning to ache. I wanted to sit somewhere cool and quiet where I could rest and think about what to do next. I looked all around me, and then I realized that I was standing by a little brown wooden gate that led into the churchyard, and the church door was open. Nobody was likely to go into a church as late as this. Even if they did, I could crouch down in a pew, and they would not see me. So I went up the path between rows of quiet gravestones, reading the names as I went. One gravestone interested me specially, and I stopped to read it again. It was just a little white cross, marking a garden of forget-me-nots, and on it was written, Jane Collins, aged 9 years, went to be with the Lord April the 5th, 1900. I read it several times and then shivered at the thought of poor little Jane Collins, who had to rise up at the strange call of death and leave this world on an April day with its sunshine and its lambs, its singing birds and its flowers. Death had always seemed a distant thing to be thought about by old people and ministers, but Jane Collins was only 9 years old, and she went to be with the Lord. What if I, aged 9, had been called suddenly to go to the Lord? What would he say to me about my bad tempers and the lies I had told and the times I had run away instead of helping and the dust under the carpet? It would be far, far worse than going to boarding school, I suspected. For the first time in my life, I began to be frightened about being so naughty. I walked onto the church porch and peeped cautiously inside. It was quite empty, so I slipped through the door and began wandering around, looking at the inscriptions and the pictures on the walls and daffodils in vases. One thing pleased me most of all, and that was the evening light streaming through the stained glass windows and falling in colored patterns on the floor, making a sort of fairy track all up the western side of the church. As I stood watching, it occurred to me how dreadfully tired I was. The church was so quiet and cool and friendly with its sunset light and its daffodils that I thought I would lie down and rest a little bit before deciding what to do next. I collected some footstools. In English Anglican churches, the pews, the rows, would have a footstool in front of it with usually a little upholstered pillow top on it, probably attached to it, but a little footstool with an upholstered pillow top on it, so that when you kneeled down to pray at various times during the service, you wouldn't be kneeling on the floor or even on a wooden bench. You'd be kneeling on a soft upholstered little bench. So, each one of the footstools would be about, 2 feet wide, 18 inches wide, maybe that high, and then the little upholstered pillow top on it would be another 2 inches above that. So I collected together some of these footstools and made a little mattress, and I wrapped myself up in an old black choir robe that was hanging near the door, and then I cuddled down inside one of the pews where I could watch the beautiful patterns and think things out. I had not realized how sleepy I was. I'd been out in the open air all day long. I'd been very frightened and very angry and very miserable, and I had run nearly 3 miles on a warm spring evening. All these things were enough to make a little girl dog tired. In fact, I was so tired that I hardly remember lying down. And before I knew it, my cares had melted away, and I could not stay awake any longer. But just as I was dropping off, I thought I saw Jane Collins standing in the sunlight light of the west window, pointing along the golden rays. She was a little girl, just like me. In my mind, I saw her with dark braids and a pinafore and blue socks. And the moment I saw her face, I know I'd made a mistake in feeling sorry for her, for never before, either in dreams or in real life, had I ever seen anyone look so radiantly happy. Her arms were full of Easter flowers, and somehow I knew that they would never fade or die. And then the light grew dimmer and blurred, and I fell into a deep, deep sleep. When I awoke, I was lying in the dark, and for a long time I couldn't imagine where I was. I was very stiff and cold and sore, for the footstools had come apart and I was lying partly on the stone floor. I thought I must be having a nightmare, and I called out for Philip, but my voice echoed horribly through the church. I didn't dare call out again, so I snuggled down, shivering under the black robe, and tried to remember what it was all about. Very gradually it came back to me. I had run away. Aunt Margaret was going to send me to boarding school. I had been very naughty, and no one would ever forgive me, and no one loved me except Philip. And I wouldn't see Philip for months and months. Then I realized that I was all alone in a great empty church, and there might be thieves or rats. Perhaps it was only about midnight, and I should have to wait hours and hours until the morning. Perhaps I should die of cold and hunger and have to go to be with the Lord like Jane Collins. I remembered my dream and felt slightly comforted until it struck me that Jane Collins had probably been a good little girl with nothing to be afraid of when she went to meet Jesus. But I had everything to be afraid of. My aunt called me a wicked girl. And now, lying there crying in the dark, I believed her for the first time. I kept remembering more and more times when I had deceived her and disobeyed her and been rude to her. I wondered whether she was still waiting for me to come home and whether they had come out to look for me. Perhaps they didn't care. Perhaps they'd all gone to bed and were lying asleep under their warm blankets while I lay dying of cold. At this thought, I felt so sorry for myself that I broke into fresh, hopeless sobbing. All this time, my face was buried in my arms, but I was getting so stiff and the floor was so hard that I sat up and changed my position. As soon as I lifted my face, I found that a wonderful thing had happened. The day was beginning to dawn, and a gray light was stealing through the eastern window on the other side of the church. The darkness was scattering, and with it, all my terrors and nightmares. Oh, I gave a great sigh of relief and sat there quite still with my small white face turned toward the morning. As I sat there waiting and listening, the dreadful silence was broken by the clear call of a bird, and I realized with a thrill of joy that the world was waking up again after a terrible night. Then another bird awoke and answered, and another, until it sounded as though every bird must be singing themselves hoarse. And as I sat there listening, the gray light gave place to gold, and the whole bird choir seemed to go mad with joy. The sun was rising, and the morning had come again. The relief was so great that I didn't want to move. I forgot that I was cold and hungry and only remembered that the night was over and that I was no longer alone because the birds were awake. Soon I would slip out of the church and run home to Philip, but for the moment I was content to just sit and listen. But I didn't sit and listen for long, for somehow my head fell over onto the footstools and I fell asleep again. And when I awoke the next time, it was very suddenly, for the church was flooded with light, and there were heavy footsteps coming down the aisle. I sat quite still and waited as the footsteps came nearer, and then my curiosity got the better of me. I crawled to the edge of the pew and peered over. It was the minister. He was walking slowly up the church aisle, looking at the eastern windows. He didn't need to have seen me at all, for his head was turned away, and I was small enough to creep under the seat. But I was just about to do this, for I did not want to be seen. I was sure that children were not allowed to sleep in churches, and there was a police station just down the road. But I'd been lying all night in a drafty church with my legs on a stone floor, and I think I'd caught a cold, so I was only half out of sight when a dreadful thing happened. I sneezed. I tried to stop, but it was no use, and it came out with a loud explosion, and the minister jumped. Then he came and looked at the pew, and there he saw half a little girl wrapped up in a robe sticking out from under the seat. He said nothing, but came and sat down, and then he leaned over and spoke very gently. "Come out," he said. "There's no need to hide under the seat. I don't mind if children come into my church." I uncurled slowly and sat down on the seat beside him and looked up into his face. He wasn't very young, but not very old, and his eyes were blue and kind. He reminded me of the old shepherd somehow, although he was not wrinkled and whiskery. It was just that he was the sort of man I wouldn't be afraid talking to. "I couldn't help but be here," I said. "I came in last night when the door was open, and I went to sleep by mistake. I put on your robe because I was cold, but I didn't mean to stay all night. Only when I woke up the first time, it was too dark to move, and when I woke up the second time, it was morning." He looked rather startled. "Do you mean that you've been here all night? Wherever is your mother? What is she thinking? We must let her know where you are at once." I was silent for a moment, twisting my hands together. I had a suddenly a funny feeling that I needed to talk to somebody about all this, and I thought that this man would do. Quite uninvited, I leaned my weary head against his shoulder. "It's not my mother," I whispered. "It's my aunt. I wouldn't have done it with my mother. I've been very, very naughty, and she's going to send me away to boarding school because she can't manage me, and I don't want to go, so I ran away, and here I am." I looked up to see if he was very shocked, but he didn't seem to be. He just looked very interested and rather sorry for me. "I'm glad you told me that," he said gravely, "and I should like you to tell me a great deal more about it, but first we must tell your aunt where you are. Then perhaps when she knows you're safe, she will let you stay for a little while and we can talk. Do you have a phone?" We did, and I knew the number. "Good," said my friend. "We'll ring your aunt at the parsonage and tell her all about it." I put my small hand into his large one, and we walked out of the church together. The world was perfectly radiant with song and light and color, but I knew it must be still very early in the morning because the flowers had not opened yet. "Why did you come to the church so early?" I asked suddenly. "I came to pray," said the minister. "I often come out early because everything looks so beautiful. Don't you think that these buttercups are enough to make anyone feel good and happy?" I looked at the buttercups, but I did not feel happy, and I was quite certain that I should never be good. Well, we have another chapter to read tomorrow called I Make a New Friend, and we certainly hope this new friend is going to help Ruth because she just gets into more and more trouble, doesn't she? And her situation seems to be getting worse and worse. But we can be glad that she is under a conviction of sin, we would say. She's beginning to realize just how very sinful her heart is and how very wrong she has been. She wasn't able to admit to herself or anybody else that she's been wrong before, but now, slowly but surely, she's coming under that conviction that she's not ready to die. She doesn't want to meet Jesus yet. She doesn't know what to do about it, but we're hoping our new friend and her new friend will tell her what to do. Come back tomorrow and let's find out. Good to be with you again. Bye.